Ladies and gentlemen, February 24th, 2022, I'm Matt Bilinsky, and this is your weekly dose of sanity, the prevailing narrative. So the two issues that have been dominating the news the last couple weeks, that would be the Russia-Ukraine crisis and then the situation up in Canada with the Freedom Convoy and the protests blocking the Ambassador Bridge in Ottawa, essentially blocking off the American-Canada border, and the Canadian government's pretty substantial measures to go and break the blockade and break up that protest, including invoking the Emergencies Act. We'll be talking about Russia in detail in a few minutes, and also later in this episode I'm going to be speaking with an incredible young journalist named Rob Arora, one of the brightest young minds in independent journalism. He caught my eye about a year and a half ago with some of his work in response to the BLM riots and anti-police protests back in 2020, and since then he's been catching the eye of a lot of the best and brightest minds in the world of independent journalism. Glenn Greenwald, for instance, today Glenn Greenwald collaborated with Rob to release his piece and his thoughts on the situation in Canada. Was recently on the Jordan Peterson podcast, and Rob has a really clear-headed and interesting perspective on what's going on in his homeland, and we're going to get into detail on that and just to kind of frame that discussion. So today, as I said, the Canada situation's tapering down a little bit. Justin Trudeau lifted the Emergency Act. So the Emergency Act is an extraordinary measure. I want to explain to you what the threshold's supposed to be for invoking the Emergency Act. So here's the text. An action or situation that seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians and is of such proportions or nature as to exceed the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it. Okay, so this is not something that is supposed to be used to address a normal protest or something that that's kind of unruly or other things that can be addressed by normal law enforcement activity. I'm not seeing how a blockade of a bridge with some trucks and a handful of surrounding very much peaceful protests, because once again, no matter how they try to frame this, for about 2 weeks this protest and this blockade went on, and there was next to no evidence whatsoever of any actual vandalism, theft, mayhem, rioting, looting, whatnot. So essentially a bunch of people parking their car on a bridge, assembling for a protest for a couple weeks that included, such dire grave situations like people singing and dancing and like a moon bounce for kids. I mean, apparently that rose to the point at which Trudeau believed that the text that I just wrote you was justified in triggering extraordinary measures and essentially declaring martial law to break up this blockade. So some people could say, well, okay, it was an emergency. He invoked the Emergencies Act. They broke up the protests. They cleared the thoroughfare, and now they can just lift the Emergencies Act as there's no longer an emergency. And I think that that's incredibly naive and overlooks so much of the dire impact and circumstances of a government taking these steps towards their own citizens, in particular in terms of financial deplatforming. Think about it. If there's kind of mayhem, a chaotic protest or something that gets out of hand, or simply just people blocking a thoroughfare, you send in law enforcement, the police go in, they're allowed to go use physical force to arrest people, to impound vehicles, and to clear that thoroughfare. Okay, this is not something that's outside the scope of what law enforcement, either one, is capable of addressing, or two, is intended to address. But they went way beyond that, right? Think about someone commits a crime. They don't get their bank accounts frozen and their credit cards deactivated. Someone gets arrested for attempted murder. They don't get their entire financial universe cut off from them. But that's what happened here in Canada. And David Sachs had an incredible piece on this that was published by Barry Weiss's Substack called "A Social Credit System Arrives in Canada." So what's the idea of this social credit system? And this is an idea that's pretty much taken hold in China, which makes no bones about it being one large surveillance state, but essentially that your activity will be monitored, and based on whether or not you're considered to, the supposed quality of your personal behavior in your day-to-day life will determine whether or not you're allowed to access to any basic goods or services or financial institutions. And so here's how Sachs kind of summarized what happened with Trudeau and some of the measures that he invoked. Trudeau escalated things further on Tuesday night when he issued a new directive called the Emergency Economic Measures Order. Invoking a war on terror law called the Proceeds of Crime and Terrorist Financing Act, the order requires financial institutions, including banks, credit unions, co-ops, loan companies, trusts, and even cryptocurrency wallets, to stop providing any financial or related services to anyone associated with the protests. I mean, listen to that. requiring financial institutions to stop providing any financially related services to anyone associated with these protests. Think about that's a complete suspension of any basic notion of civil liberties. That's a government declaring war on its people. Once again, think about all the ways that a person can engage in criminality, even up to murder. Do you get your bank accounts frozen other than in very particular circumstances of white-collar crime when you're simply not allowed to access your bank account to continue with the crime being alleged? That doesn't happen. Essentially, the government of Canada declared financial war on some of its citizens. And if you look at this, there's no way, there's no thorough dissection of this where this was justified. It's been a complete mischaracterization of what was going on. And once again, they had every right to use law enforcement to break up these protests. These people were breaking the law. They should have been arrested, and they should be filtered through the judicial system with due process and the presumption of innocence and all that entails. But that's not what happens here. Trudeau and everybody else involved in the government were trying to portray this as an actual attempt to overthrow the government. You even got a senator from Ottawa, Senator Arnault. This was not a political protest. This was a well-organized and well-funded attempt to overthrow the government. Like, you can say that, but there's no support for that whatsoever. This was a protest. These were people blocking a bridge. That's it. Go use the normal tools of law enforcement to go and stop that. Okay, you don't get to go declare martial law and essentially go enact a bunch of legal measures that were intended for the war on terror, which were of justifiable legality in that case either. So I think people need to look at I think a lot of people are, and I think this is one of the dynamics that led to Trudeau lifting the Emergencies Act so quickly, is that he knew that people were not going to stand for this. He knew that, your average, let's call it I don't want to say your swing voter, but your swing resident in Canada was not necessarily buying the story, right? That he was turning off a lot of people in taking these extraordinary measures against fellow citizens. And you can call someone an insurrectionist as much as you want, but when people are saying that these people truly were peaceful in nature, they're not going to stand for people being financially deplatformed and cut off from financial institutions, nor should they be. But I think we're going to see a lot of political fallout here for Justin Trudeau. This did not make him look good, and he was, as I'll discuss with Rob, I think, playing a game he was not meant for. He's not a guy who feels comfortable with in the midst of hostilities. He's not a fighter. And these truckers, the Freedom Convoy, forced him to get his hands dirty. He needed to throw his weight around. He needed to show off his authority. And okay, he did so, but it's not going to be without fallout. I think he's lost the trust of a lot of people who at one time either were supporters or were simply kind of non-participants, people who are probably mildly involved in the political sphere. And now their ears are perked up a little bit, wondering, wait a second, we got to be a little more suspicious of the government here. We got to be looking over our shoulder in case they do go ahead and abuse their power. And so at the end of this episode, like I said, my discussion with Rob Arora, and we dive into this situation head first. Okay, so tonight, Russia has invaded the Ukraine, an actual invasion. This is something that had been teased, it had been discussed, and even announced a number of times over the last couple weeks, including a couple days ago, but officially tonight was a full-blown ground invasion and air bombardment of the Ukraine by Russian forces. Senator Marco Rubio has actually been documenting this quite well. Marco Rubio, to clarify what is underway, is a full-scale and comprehensive military assault throughout the Ukraine. Airborne and amphibious landings, missile strikes from air, ground, and naval forces, electronic and cyber attacks, and a large ground force to occupy a large swath of territory. History never sleeps, my friend. Everyone thinks, as Francis Fukuyama infamously put it in his book, The End of History. Well, history is now back with a vengeance. Every time we think that we've kind of settled into this peaceful, stable pattern, we all eventually learn that was just an illusion. Some people believe that the Trump election in 2016 was the wake-up call there, and very much, if we weren't already woken up, I think we're all awake now. And essentially that the international order that was established by the Americans after the Cold War ended, was a period of relative stability that nobody had really experienced for centuries. I mean, the 19th and 20th century had been very warlike, very hostile, and a pretty aggressive battle amongst various empires and strategic and hegemonic interests. And that's something that we didn't see at the end of the 20th century into the early 21st century, because America was just so dominant, right? And what we're seeing here, okay, so let's take this one One, in terms of ethics and morality and who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. And listen, I think that's a very overly simplistic way to look at things. And clearly, listen, any war of aggression, or war of conquest, the aggressor, the one who first attacks, always has a certain degree of moral culpability. And Vladimir Putin is clearly in that position in this case. And in terms of anticipating, the extent, in what way is he the villain, the bad guy, and to what extent can we anticipate this to play out? We still have to look at this through historical perspective, because that's the way that Putin looks at it. There's a really good piece that I think everyone should read. Julia Ioffe, I think is the way you pronounce the last name. It is Ioffe. It was in The Atlantic from 2018. And it's called What Putin Really Wants. And believe it or not, there was a very good summation and actually digging into Putin's actual speeches throughout the years and trying to anticipate his real motives and perspectives, as opposed to just the fanciful fantasies that people drudged up about him during the Trump years, most of which, looking back on it, it turned out to be completely incorrect. And this guy thinks historically. Okay, he believes in, even as he was kind of documented as commenting to a number of American diplomats during the Clinton and then the Obama years, is that he believes that the relative period of Russia's weakness in the 90s and 2000s was just a blip on the radar. He believes that Russia is, he has a lot of national pride and that Russia is a historically significant country and always will be, and that in trying to marginalize Russia, and with the U.S. and NATO trying to absorb all the former Russian republics and Eastern European countries into their sphere of influence, and prospectively NATO, that put a kind of a breach in the space-time continuum, that's not how things should be, and that the U.S. and the Western alliance was being very short-sighted in seeing things that way, that they could essentially operate with immunity, and that Russia would never challenge them strategically. And that, of course, turned out to be, once again, taking the morality and the ethics aside, just from a pure strategic perspective, Putin turned out to be right. Eventually, that the Americans would be in a position, would lose enough leverage, and he would gain enough leverage that he could make a move such as this, and he could feel confident enough in doing so. What are the long-term prospects here for Russia and for the U.S.? I mean, the U.S. is in no position, and NATO is in no position to engage, to participate militarily here. Okay, Putin, in all likelihood, is going to seize significant parts of the Ukraine, whether he's going to annex the nation itself and it's all going to be part of Mother Russia once again. That's probably kind of splitting hairs at some point, but the Ukraine will become, to a certain degree, a vassal state of Russia, which it to a certain extent kind of was even post-Soviet Union, definitely until there was an uprising against the president who was very Russia-friendly in 2014, and he was overthrown, which then led to Vladimir Putin to invade Crimea and annex that section of the Ukraine. So this is not necessarily without precedent. It's just a little higher scale. So the U.S. and the Western alliance, they're going to have to sanction Russia heavily. That means cutting Russia off from essentially any international economic activity. And I can't imagine that Vladimir Putin doesn't anticipate that. And he appears to believe that he can weather that storm. Kind of goes back to the usual suspects and the kind of mythology of Kaiser Soze, as Kevin Spacey's character is describing it, is that the only thing that he recognized is that all you needed was more will than the other guy. And apparently Vladimir Putin believes that he has the will to do what the other guy won't, that he is willing to make Russia an international pariah, that it can survive on its own, that he can starve Europe and the West of natural gas and oil and other resources that Russia has, and that they'll be fine, and that their strategic alliances are powerful enough to withstand any stranglehold, economic sanctions and stranglehold from the West. Will that be the case? That remains to be seen. You have to wonder in the back of your mind if this is not an indicator of stronger ties between Russia and China. We all know China doesn't give two rats' asses about the Ukraine. They have no moral or ethical qualms with what Putin is doing. And if Russia is now allying itself with China, and this is almost a proxy war in the battle between East and West, the polarity of the China sphere of influence and the American sphere of influence, that's another way to look at this right now. So, of course, we sometimes, war is it's so cinematic that we sometimes forget the human cost cost. And obviously there's horrendous tragedies occurring as I speak this sentence right now in the Ukraine. Hopefully the military hostilities are going to end as soon as possible. I can't imagine they last more than a couple weeks given the relative asymmetry of military power between Russia and the Ukraine. But you've got to anticipate, regardless of the morality of it or him as a bad actor, you can't anticipate that Vladimir Putin is not being rational in his projections here, right? That he understands the U.S. and its allies are going to put some economic pressure on him, a ton of economic pressure. And he's calculated that Russia can withstand that. And so that is the thing to keep your eye on. Why does he think he can get away with this? Does he think that that the U.S. and Europe, that, in killing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, cutting off the flow of natural gas from Russia to mainland Europe, that is going to, in response, put so much economic pressure and suffering on the European mainland and on the EU that Vladimir, his calculations are correct, that he can withstand the squeeze of this geopolitical struggle better than the West can. These are the things that we need to be looking out for. So, everyone, once again, when you look at this situation, I definitely think some people on the right, some conservatives, are just really missing the boat here. Contrarian perspective here. This is Candace Owens' tweet from the other day. I suggest every American who wants to know what's actually going on in Russia and Ukraine read this transcript of Putin's address. As I've said for a month, NATO, under direction from the United States, is violating previous agreements and expanding eastward. We, capitalized, are at fault. That's incorrect. At the same time, understand that the framing of the framing of the battle between or the view of Putin as this kind of evil warlord and the United States and its alliance as completely beyond reproach, you can understand that framing may be somewhat off and still understand that Vladimir Putin is the aggressor here, okay? Someone who initiates the military hostilities, regardless of, just because the U.S. and NATO and the Ukraine did not give in to every single demand made by Vladimir Putin does not mean that they're at fault, okay? Just because the Ukraine did not entirely submit to Putin's demands does not mean that it is the instigator, the aggressor in a military confrontation, okay? And that's just essentially the lengths to which some people will go, the super contrarian right wing with Candace Owens and those types, in order to put everything on the U.S. because the current administration is not one that they respect or that they support. I mean, this is not the way to look at things. Okay, Putin was the aggressor. Ukraine was under no obligation. There was no breach of a treaty, an alliance, a pact, or anything of that nature that was committed by the Ukraine and simply not agreeing to never join NATO, okay, that would warrant the initiation of hostilities by Putin here. So that point of view is completely invalid. Okay, separately from that, you can understand that we may have to reassess what our strategic priorities are, and the United States strategic positioning, because what we seem to have done here is, once again, we drag that perspective from the late 90s out way too long, and that we assumed that we were the all-powerful sovereign hegemonic nation, and that essentially any country that could even be considered to have been friendly was a candidate to be within our sphere of influence and potentially a military ally, whether in NATO or otherwise. And that's a perspective that may have been valid in 1998 that was no longer valid even as early as 2014 to 16, and is certainly not true as of 2022. And you have to understand that it may not be in our interest to be militarily involved or to engage militarily on some battlegrounds that we might have felt comfortable engaging on before the Iraq War, before we lost a ton of credibility on the international stage over the course of the last 15 to 20 years under multiple presidents, okay? I mean, George W. Bush is the one that lit the fuse here, but there's no shortage of blame to go around across a couple different administrations here. So we have to reassess our strategic interests here, because, listen, the American economy is going to suffer. I mean, the market's going to bounce back. Right now, it's an immediate reaction. The Dow futures are down something like 1,000 points. Crypto's getting crushed. This is all going to come back eventually and things are going to stabilize, but it certainly does not serve our economic interests to be on bad terms with Russia. I mean, we rely on them for natural gas and other natural resources as well, and given a incredibly interconnected global economy, cutting off one big node in that network certainly is going to be disruptive to the world economic system. But that's something that's, sooner or later, things are going to stabilize on that level. And the Biden administration is going to have to reassess domestic energy policy, okay? Shelving the Keystone Pipeline, things of that nature. I'm sorry. America has to do everything in its power to be energy independent, okay? And unless something, and a lot of the environmental concerns around Keystone, I don't know, dude. I looked into them. The environmentalists claim that Keystone is going to essentially, melt the polar ice caps within an hour and a half. Like I don't buy it. They're complete exaggerations, and you have to understand that our ability to extract oil and natural gas and our other natural resources is part and parcel to our national security. That's a reality we're just going to have to accept. So I think that reassessing, trying this contrarian repackaging of America and NATO as the aggressors and Vladimir Putin as simply reacting to that, no, that I'm not on board with that. But also reassessing our strategic interests and where we may find, one, our limits to power, and two, our limits on interest in militarily engaging in certain conflicts. Those are things that are going to be that do need reassessment. So this situation, I'm recording this on Wednesday night, literally an hour and a half after the invasion was announced. There's going to be a lot more coming out on this topic. Thoughts and prayers with everybody in the Ukraine. Okay, so let's get into some COVID stuff here for a second. I'm not entirely sure how much longer this is going to remain a newsworthy topic, but as of the moment, it is. Okay, so as I've discussed a bunch of times, there's some regions, states, countries have kind of become proxy wars for varying views around COVID, around which policies were correct and whatnot. You got Sweden, you got Australia, South Korea, and another proxy battle that has been waged, at least for the past year and a half, has been California versus Florida, because they're two states that have a lot of kind of similar characteristics, but took two diametrically opposed approaches to COVID, with Florida being incredibly permissive and remaining open for the most part, and California being just so restrictive. So let me take you back to September 2020. I had been in Los Angeles in California for essentially the entire time of the pandemic at that point, from March through September. And then actually this is through October. Then the end of October, I went and traveled. I went to Austin, Texas, Dallas, Texas, Nashville for a moment, and then to Miami, Florida. And I got to see how the other side was living. And at California at the time was a dark, dark existence. There was no indoor life whatsoever. Every business was shut down. The streets were still pretty empty. I mean, it felt like I Am Legend even through September, October 2020. And if you have no frame of reference, you figure, okay, well, this is what a pandemic looks like. This is how life goes during a pandemic, and everyone has to remain indoors for the most part. And it's going to turn, your wherever you live into a darker, less lively place. So then I go and I travel a little bit and I see, wait a second, this is not how everybody is living. That some of these other states are operating semi-normal. That while, there are people wearing masks, you have some limitations on indoor occupancy. You'll see selectively some businesses are closed. There are no big events, but generally, there are people out on the streets. There's traffic, there's cars, there's actual life going on in these cities. And that's what I saw when I went to Texas, when I went to Tennessee, and when I went to Florida. And I go to Florida and I'm like, wait a second, Miami, it looks like 2019. Like everyone seems to be operating completely normally. And so then you think, well, okay, is that leading to just terror? Is that leading to COVID just ravaging these places? And the answer was not really. I mean, if you looked at Florida after a bit of a rise in COVID cases and deaths in the summer of 2020 into the fall and into the winter, COVID was pretty low out there. And so the thesis of if we allow for normal social and business activity, there's just going to be, we're going to be ravaged by the pandemic. That turned out not to be true. It was that, okay, you could split hairs over whether, X region that was more open had a slightly higher rate of COVID and slightly more deaths and hospitalizations, but you're really operating within some pretty compressed boundaries there. Like they're within striking distance of each other, but they weren't. The places weren't within striking distance in terms of life quality. You go back to California and it would be like one big funeral, and then you go back to Florida and the place would be just brimming with happiness. So you're thinking, well, wait a second. Something's up here. Like some of the orthodoxies that were being told about what happens if you allow your city or your state to remain open simply aren't true. Okay, so this has been an ongoing proxy battle, Florida versus California. So there's a gentleman named Andy Slavitt. He's a public health official. He was an acting administrator for the Center of Medicare and Medicaid during the late Obama administration, and he was a vocal critic of President Trump during the pandemic while Trump was still in office. And then he was high up in the Biden administration. He was a senior advisor on COVID and vaccine rollouts for Biden once he took office. So this is a surrogate of Joe Biden and the Biden administration on COVID. Andy Slavitt is always trying to justify the more restrictive approach that the Democrats have taken, that the Biden administration has taken, and that's his shtick, right? He's always trying to justify that. So obviously, as COVID, essentially disappears and the measures that he has advocated for 2 years now become just completely nonsensical, although they were always kind of nonsensical, he's trying to find cover on how he explains this away, that it's okay to drop these things now, but wasn't previously. So he goes on a Twitter thread earlier this week, and one of his posts decides to do the California-Florida breakdown. And here is the post. It's a graph tracking cumulative deaths and death rate, and then the caption is, Florida has a 60% higher death rate than California. Was that at a cost to the economy? No. In 2021, California's economy grew at 11.7%, more than 50% above Florida's rate. Pretending the pandemic doesn't exist isn't a working strategy. Wow. Okay. Well, on its face, that tweet seems pretty probative, right? Florida ended up with a higher death rate overall than California. And for this 1 year period that Andy Slavitt decided to choose, they had a higher economic growth rate as well. Does that check out once you put it to scrutiny? Surprise, surprise, it does not check out in the least. Where to begin with the dishonesty and the inaccuracies in this post? Okay, first off, let's go just to death rate. You have to take into account the underlying conditions in the two states. You've got California is the 7th youngest state in the nation. Florida is the 5th oldest. So can you do an age-adjusted graph? Can you come up with statistics that are age-adjusted based on the age of population and the death rate in that regard? Yes, you can. And as it turns out, both Florida and California in age-adjusted death rate did pretty damn well. I think California was 15th lowest in the nation, and Florida was 17th lowest. So if you're looking at COVID health outcomes, accounting for the fact that Florida has a lot more elderly people than California, they landed in just about the same place. Beyond that, you look at excess mortality, right? Not just deaths from COVID, but additional deaths overall. Scott Atlas, a former COVID advisor to the Trump administration, but not a very Trumpy guy. This guy's is an independent career beyond. It's not heavy MAGA, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Florida, 5th oldest state, opened schools and living normally for a year and a half, avoided severe harm of lockdowns, versus California, 7th youngest state, stringent shutdowns, excess mortality during the entire pandemic. Both California and Florida are at about 18% excess mortality. Okay, so beyond, because once again, the health of your society or whether or not you handled this pandemic correctly is not just a singular function of COVID hospitalizations and deaths. It's were you able to balance the various concerns of the goodwill and the welfare of your people properly, right? So overall, how many more people died than normally during the years of the pandemic? Florida and California both at about 18%. So it looks like, California's measures to prevent more COVID deaths seems to have sprung up in additional harm and additional fatalities based on other causes. And it landed California and Florida in just about the same spot. 1, excess mortality, and 2, age-adjusted COVID deaths, despite the fact that one region allowed essentially normal social and business activity, and the other one essentially created a dead zone for about 2 years. California was absolutely a dead zone through the spring of 2021. Yes, once things opened up, and I believe it was April 2021, it started to resemble somewhat of a normal society, but I'm telling you, California was not a happy place during 2020 and early 2021. So Andy Slavitt, a guy who's supposed to be just the utmost in credibility, a surrogate of the president and the Biden administration, just outright lying about the nature of health outcomes from COVID amongst these two states. Now let's look at the economy. He mentioned that California's economy grew at 11.7% in 2021, and Florida's economy only grew at about 5.5%, 6%. Of course, California's economy grew at 11.5% in 2021. It was closed in 2020. They shut the entire goddamn thing down. Of course, when it's coming from a lower baseline, you're going to have a higher percentage growth. So, once again, Andy Slavitt being incredibly manipulative, disingenuous, and dishonest with the boundaries, with the data that he decided to choose. He's lying with data and ignoring the lower baseline created by what California did to its economy in 2020 to then try to falsely portray that it grew because it grew more in 2021, it was healthier. No, it grew more in 2021 because it had been sunk in 2020. Florida showed a more normal growth pattern because it didn't shut down its economy in 2020. In fact, Florida, throughout the entire pandemic, has shown above average, if you're taking all states, above average economic growth and above average job growth every month throughout the entire pandemic. Okay, so the state that remained the most open, that allowed its citizens to live the most normal, still did not suffer any economic consequences in terms of growth or jobs. Okay, so that is also was incredibly disingenuous of Slavitt. Beyond that, let's look at some other factors that imply how a region is doing. California experienced its first reduction in population in recorded history in 2020. In the first time in recorded history, more people left California than moved to it in 2020. And you want to know something? That repeated itself in 2021. It's kind of a strange pattern. Conversely, Florida and Texas had the number 1 and 2 in net migration inflow in 2021. So lots of people are leaving California and lots of people are moving to Florida and to Texas. So if your narrative and your thesis is California handled the pandemic well and Florida handled the pandemic not well because more people died in Florida and the economy still seemed to be doing well in California, so you didn't have the additional restrictions to reduce COVID deaths did not harm the economy. That simply doesn't add up. It's not true by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, if Florida seems to be doing so poorly, why the hell are all these people moving here? It's not just people, it's businesses as well. California has had 265 companies either move or relocate their corporate headquarters over the past 2 years. Those are companies including Apple, Nestle, Oracle, Tesla, Gordon Ramsay restaurants. All these companies move their corporate headquarters away from California. Okay, and this is even if you want to get into the anecdotal stuff, the anecdotes and the data both match up, right? Everybody here in California knows a ton of their friends that have hightailed it, said, "Hey, this is just not a happy place anymore. There's crime. We've got crime. We've got homelessness problems. You add that to the more drab existence created by the additional COVID restrictions, and I'm sorry, California's leaders does not protect the general welfare and happiness and goodwill of its citizenry. And by all estimations, Florida did. Okay. And so this is more troubling coming from someone like Andy Slavitt. It's like, why does everything need to be politicized? Like, clearly he's not trying to tell the truth. He's just trying to justify Democrat policy choices. He's just trying to shine a more positive light on the Biden administration's choices. And he's using the California versus Florida example as a proxy for that. And it's even stranger that he thought he could get away with it. But a lot of people will indulge this. They'll take one look at this graph and his commentary to it and think, yeah, okay, more people died in Florida than in California, and the economy in California grew in 2021 more than it grew in Florida. So, okay, the economic harm must have not been that bad either. And they won't look any further than that. And this is just so cynical, and it's so condescending. And someone who's as high up in the administration as Andy Slavitt, it sends a terrible message, and it really is a bad omen for where we are, that the Biden administration wants to use this person as their messenger, and that this is the battle that they want to fight, that they're going to hold up California as the gold standard of how we should have handled COVID. The economy did very well. It had, good health outcomes, but it's simply not true. You have to ignore so much. You have to ignore all the crime. You have to ignore the excess mortality. You have to ignore all the net outflow migration. The fact that so many people want to leave this state right now, that matters. You can't ignore that. But hey, because because the state of California tracked most closely to Democrat Party orthodoxy on COVID, that's the story they're going to go with. And it's, once again, it's incredibly dishonest. And I'm not here just to criticize the Democrats because they're Democrats. I'm criticizing the Democrats here because they're trafficking in lies about things that really impacted people's lives. They chose a course that really impacted people's lives. It changed communities forever. I'm sorry, it's going to take a long time for California and Los Angeles to recover quality of life, okay? And if they want to make the argument that it was justified based on the health outcomes, I don't believe that holds up. I don't believe that's, I don't buy their argument. And I think they're going to keep on trafficking in this. But it's clear that this is what they're going to do. They're going to hold California up as the gold standard. They're going to vilify and demonize the approach that Florida took. And I don't think that story checks out. Much like Justin Trudeau noticed that the political tides were turning against them, I think you're seeing that the political tides are turning against the Democrats on this as well, particularly as even, many blue cosmopolitan regions start to lift all their COVID restrictions. I think you're going to see a lot of strange stuff on them trying to explain away the more restrictive approach that they took, because people, whether or not people supported it at one time, they certainly do not support it any longer. And now, coming up in just a minute, my discussion with Rob Arora on all things on the recent situation with the Canada Freedom Convoy, Justin Trudeau's invocation and then release of the Emergencies Act, and how this really seems to be one of the many interesting kind of proxy battles that tell the story of COVID over the last couple of years, and kind of an oddly and eerily poetic way for us to essentially end the pandemic after 2 years. Super interesting discussion, and I hope you guys enjoy it. Ladies and gentlemen, this is The Prevailing Narrative. I am here today with Rob Arora, one of the top up-and-coming independent journalists in the game. Rob, you're coming to us today out of Vancouver, Canada. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And so Rob and I met a little while ago, and he was in town from Vancouver. We were in Los Angeles, and Rob was describing to me how we probably wouldn't see each other in person anytime soon, because Rob was unvaccinated and was going back to Canada, and the laws in Canada prevented anyone who's unvaccinated from air travel, domestic or international air travel. The rules and regulations around vaccine uptake obviously became a hot button issue recently, as it became grounds for the recent Freedom Convoy protests in Canada and the government's ensuing crackdown. And so Rob has been all over this topic, and today released a piece called From a Young Canadian, Authoritarianism, Media Propaganda and Repression, and essentially his perspective on the government's ongoing despotic response to the convoy protest. So Rob, we'll get into the meat of that in just a second, but wanted to frame this discussion for everybody with just real quick on the story that the piece that you originally wrote that brought you to the public consciousness, and then some of the work that you've been doing around myocarditis that has also got a lot of publicity and very much feeds into the current battle over vaccine policy in Canada.
Yeah, so the piece that brought me to the public consciousness was my essay on white privilege. This was 2020, summer of 2020, July or August. And I wrote this big essay on the fallacies of white privilege and why I thought that our current discourse surrounding identity politics and racial privilege was eroding our common ground and our common humanity. And so I was looking at disparities across the board in health, education, income, crime, and puncturing this whole narrative that white Americans or white Canadians are surpassing minority individuals, people from different backgrounds, from Africa, from the Middle East, from Asia. So I was looking at that and showing that in terms of education, in terms of income, white Americans are not even close to the top. It's like several other groups like Indian Americans, Pakistani Americans, Nigerian Americans, Taiwanese Americans who are out earning white Americans, have higher levels of education, higher net worths, higher high school graduation rates, lower crime rates. And so I provided this alternative perspective during a time when race had become such a hot button topic, and conversations around systemic racism and white privilege were dominating the media discourse. So I provided this new perspective, which kind of brought me into the forefront of the conversation. And since then I've been writing about crime, policing, what's been happening in Minneapolis after George Floyd happened, and after the police retreated and the rise in crime there that nobody's covering. And then I've been following the identity politics discourse since then. And then last summer, I would say, when BC, British Columbia, the province I'm in right now, announced their vaccine passport system, which barred unvaccinated people like myself from working out at a gym, from going to a bar, nightclubs, large gatherings, weddings. And then when Trudeau announced federally that I was unable to leave the country or fly within the country or travel within the country through train, by train rather, after like November 30th, then I was like, whoa, we are sliding into a full-on tyrannical regime that I just did not know was possible. And, you know, from the start with the whole COVID discourse, I was never really following it that closely. Like, you know, cases are rising, cases are falling, new, you know, ICUs are rising, they're falling, and all these different waves are happening and the different variants. And it was just too much for me to follow. And I just didn't really care as long as my freedoms were still mostly intact. But then when my freedoms were taken away, then I was like, okay, now I have a platform and I need to voice my concerns for all these people who don't have a platform and do the responsible thing and write about it and voice my opinion, even though it creates a lot of backlash and you get attacks for being an anti-vaxxer or some right-wing extremist, or you want to kill grandma, some unempathetic kind of person. So I started writing about vaccine mandates, and that kind of slowly went into writing about myocarditis.
Which it was another kind of hot button, very controversial proxy war around COVID, because it became the risks of myocarditis in particular case groups from vaccination did seem to give rise to concern, and that has then been kind of, you know, there's been strong opposition to those concerns, which you seem to have researched very thoroughly. And I think, you know, as you were mentioning, there's kind of a common thread to all of this, whether it be the conversation around racial preferences, privileges, and oppression, the vaccine mandates in general, or the concerns about myocarditis, in that the media narrative and the reality on the ground don't seem to align. That once you start to put the media narrative under scrutiny, it doesn't really seem to hold up. And the response to someone noticing that and vocalizing that conflict seems to be pretty harsh. I imagine the response to your original writing on the white privilege issue and the response to your writing on myocarditis seem to have quite a few commonalities.
Yeah. And then also, as we'll talk about in a bit, the writing today about the truckers' convoy protests. It's the same thing. The media is just so out of touch from reality. It's almost like they've taken, you know, some kind of drug, right? Some kind of perception altering drug, which is progressivism or wokeism, or, you know, whatever, radical leftism, you know, critical race theory, you know, radical gender theory, all these things. It's like these things, these radical ideas that come out of the social science departments from elite universities, they are so disconnected from reality. They're completely delusional. I mean, there's so many examples like this. I mean, one being that I've written about, this idea that there is some broad consensus among Black Americans that the police are to be feared. They are something that we need less of. They are a threat to Black communities. It's like that's the prevailing wisdom.
Yeah, that's a POV that's reflected by most of the media class. And then every time actual members of that community or inner city communities are polled, the polling shows something completely different.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, poll after poll shows that Black Americans, a majority of them want the same level or higher levels of policing. And then when you poll or when you interview people within the communities that are most vulnerable, like Minneapolis, they're even more desperate. Like, they're like, we're dying for the police. We're calling for the police.
Yeah.
And they can't come because they're short like 400 officers, because after George Floyd, the politicians said they would abolish them or defund them. Mm-hmm. So police were demoralized and they left and crime rose. So that's just one example. But it's the same kind of dynamic when it comes to vaccine mandates as well. like it's.
And so let's, something I want to back up just 1 second because of your work on myocarditis, and this is still a topic that so many people have a different perspective on, a different understanding of where the consensus is at. It seems to be that there was a palpable and justifiable concern about a rising prevalence of cases of myocarditis, which is a low grade heart issue, in response to the vaccine, in particular amongst young people who also were seemingly not as at as much risk of severe outcomes from COVID. And then, this was all filtered through conversations on the Joe Rogan podcast because he mentioned this often. And then a kind of a contrarian voice came on his podcast and mentioned, it seems like the risk of myocarditis from contracting COVID is more significant than the risk of contracting myocarditis from the vaccine. And that seemed to shut down the conversation. And Rogan acknowledged, hey, I might not have thought about that. And that seemed to be a pretty strong counter argument. But your research actually shows something different. Your research shows that if you isolate one particular and pretty expansive identity group, and that would be young males ages, I believe, 16 to 24, the risk of myocarditis from the vaccine actually is higher than the risk of myocarditis from contracting COVID.
Yes. Yeah. And it actually goes up until 40, according to a new paper that came out end of December by researchers from Oxford. So not fringe conservative scientists, but people from Oxford. They did this analysis showing that for men ages 16 to 39, the risk of myocarditis is higher with the vaccine than from COVID. But it's specifically not just vaccinations in general, but with Moderna dose 1, 2, and 3, and Pfizer dose 2 and 3. So with Pfizer dose 1, no, but with all the Moderna doses and Pfizer dose 2 and 3, the risk of myocarditis is significantly higher. And other studies show this as well. And the study that that individual brought on, the Australian political commentator Josh Sepps, that study is fairly dated. There's been better research done on this afterwards. That study, I think, goes back to last spring or last summer. And in that study, as was shown by a later study, which had Dr. Tracy Hogue, who's an epidemiologist who I've interviewed before, in her study, which is featured in The Guardian, and that study, which Joe Rogan featured in his podcast a few times, that was the study he brought up when he was debating Dr. Sanjay Gupta. And he brought up that study, which showed that for boys ages 12 to 16 or 14 to 16, I think it was 12 to 16, the rate of myocarditis is 4 to 6 times higher with the vaccine than from COVID. And that's it actually was worse than that. It was the risk of myocarditis is higher from the vaccine than from risk of any hospitalization from COVID, not just myocarditis. So it's a massive disparity. And that study highlighted that the initial study that was done, which Josh Sepps brought up. Sorry, this might be confusing. That study underestimated underestimated COVID infections, and so that threw off the denominator and made it seem like myocarditis is much higher with COVID than it actually is. But if you take a much more accurate estimate of COVID infections, which is a much higher rate because so many people don't test, right? So many people are asymptomatic. Once you do that, you find that myocarditis from COVID is extremely rare, generally extremely rare. But among young men, it's incredibly rare. It's so small, it's almost unquantifiable. So Josh Sepps brought up that study, and Joe Rogan, who had seen the other study, was a bit confused, but he was still kind of willing to acknowledge it. And then I had this long piece, which I think, Matt, you and I might have talked about this when I was in LA. This piece I'd written since like September, and slowly kind of built more and more content into it as more studies and more research came out. But no publication would accept this piece because it was so controversial, and for a variety of other reasons, like me not being a science journalist or somebody with a bachelor's degree in any scientific program. So I I had a pretty difficult time trying to find a publication to publish this, and so eventually,
And this is including traditionally, let's call it right-leaning publications. Nobody wanted to touch this, despite the fact that it was incredibly comprehensive, detailed, and well-researched, right? It seems like people would want to publish pieces that are more granular in nature and more specific and targeted.
Yeah. I mean, if I was making the rules, if I was the head of the New York Times and looking at some, writer who's done all this research, who's interviewed epidemiologists, doctors, medical experts from Stanford, like Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, who I interviewed for the article, Dr. Mike Hart from Toronto, excuse me. If I was setting the rules, that kind of a piece would be in, one of the front pages of the New York Times, or, it would be featured. There would be space for that because it's such an important topic. And not to sound arrogant here, but that piece was very well balanced, looking at the research and the anecdotes and talking to the experts.
And anyone out there, and once again, the discourse around COVID has all these strange proxy wars, right? And it was from treatments like hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin, and impacts and reactions like myocarditis. Another one of these kind of become the battlegrounds over who is a denialist and who is a caring individual, right? And if you do question the risk of myocarditis from the vaccines, or question the nature of the conversation between Rogan and Zepps, I encourage everyone to go check out Rob's piece and see, make up your own mind. See, does this seem well researched? Does this seem like it anticipated and addressed counter arguments, right? Because that's what we're trying to do here. And yet we see this habitually, and it kind of speaks to the nature of COVID discourse as very dogmatic, that anytime that there is a valid, legitimate argument that there might be a weakness in one of the orthodoxies, that is not necessarily fatal to the entire orthodoxy. You're not trying to claim that the vaccines don't work, or that anyone that they pose more risk of harm than benefit. But you narrow down one particular aspect of this that does kind of poke a hole in their argument, and they just can't even entertain it. They cannot even allow for acknowledge one weakness in the argument, because that would seem to bring down the whole house of cards. But that would seem to reflect more on the foundation of the argument in the first place than in contrarian arguments.
Yeah. It's so bizarre how these orthodoxies form, and they're so rigid, and questioning them is heretical. And it's just the orthodoxy is established, and for some reason the incentives are in place, the structures are in place, and it's become this rigid ideology of sorts. And shifting from that, or making any concessions, or changing with the progression of science,
available evidence,
the newer evidence that comes is just not possible with the current dynamics that we have. It's like we're mandating boosters now. In over 300 U.S. colleges have mandated booster shots for undergraduate students. Like, what are we doing? You've already mandated double vaccination, which is already a massive violation of basic human rights and civil liberties. Okay. And you've already done something that is so egregious to me. And now you're mandating a booster shot that has no long-term efficacy or safety data. They haven't studied the booster shot because it's so freaking new, and what the implications are for myocarditis. We don't even know what's going on. We'll find
amongst
out
a low risk group.
We'll find out in 6 months to a year what's going to happen. There was recent a couple of students from Yale, I believe, who got myocarditis. One of which individual, I tweeted this out. He had a fatal case of myocarditis after getting.
So there have been fatal cases documented.
Oh, there have been fatal cases of vaccine-induced myocarditis in the U.S. Now, I'm not saying there's an epidemic of people dying from this at all. I'm saying that this is a real problem, And the average case of myocarditis is usually like not requiring like heart surgery or heart transplant or anything of that magnitude. But an average case of myocarditis is usually 3 to 6 months of no physical activity or very limited physical activity, no sports, no working out, even walking upstairs could be limited, taking several different medications with side effects, and being at a lifelong risk of cardiac implications, as I outlined in my article. So that's no big deal. But that in various debates I've had with other individuals, they say like, oh no, that's just a small price to pay for, preventing death from COVID or preventing hospitalization from COVID. But when we're talking about individuals in a low risk population, that's not a real risk. And so
Yeah.
myocarditis is a higher risk. And so thankfully this article I wrote, it went viral on my Substack. I think over 100,000 people read it on my Substack, which is great.
Are you seeing a warming up to the ideas presented in that? There's a bit of a breaking of the ice, that there's not quite as much resistance today as there was maybe 2-3 months ago?
It's hard to say, because it's hard to have my work. It's hard for anybody's work to be read by those outside of their bubble. So like for me, I've been getting, so much reinforcement from, Jordan Peterson, who shared the article, Joe Rogan, who shared the article and appreciated the analysis that I gave, because that was an issue that he had been grappling with and he'd been attacked for that. So I've been getting a lot of great feedback from high places. But I have been getting some critiques from other individuals who I cannot name, unfortunately. People.
We will let the haters stay anonymous for the moment.
They can be, but people from pretty high places have critiqued it as well. So it's the conversation, I think, on the ground when you talk to parents, right? It's like there's no like desperate urge to vaccinate their teenagers, right? Even if you look at polls, parents are far more hesitant to vaccinate their children and their teenagers than themselves, right? But with these conversations to some extent are kind of irrelevant to the medical establishment, to big pharma, and to the federal and state governments, who are all colluding and have passed these draconian measures to mandate now booster shots, as we're seeing. And there seems to be very little impact from our discourse on what's being passed in terms of legislation, which I think is one of the greatest travesties of our time.
No doubt. And so I'm obviously trying to kind of gauge the tenor and the views of, people up in Canada, and because we hear, we're hearing some of these more divisive issues and activities going on in Canada, in particular, in reaction, as we'll get to in a second, the Freedom Convoy. And to a lot of us here in the States, and we do, have more of a kind of enduring heritage in terms of freedom and whatnot. And we think, how could this be happening in this kind of quiet, pleasant neighboring country, Canada? So it's tough to gauge how what's going on with boots on the ground and how the population actually feels. So getting to your piece released today regarding the Canadian government's reaction to the recent freedom convoys, what is the tenor amongst the population? They're trying to poll this, and it seems that there is a slight majority in favor of taking some of these extraordinary and extrajudicial measures that the Canadian government has taken against the truckers, not only to arrest them and to impound their vehicles to unclog the thoroughfares, but also taking some actions against them financially, freezing bank accounts, investigating crypto wallets and things of that nature. Do a lot of people see this as an ominous overreach, or do they find the truckers as a thorn in the side and they're just happy to remove the thorn?
Yeah, so it depends who you talk to. If we're talking about provincial leaders, so in Saskatchewan, Quebec, Alberta, I believe Manitoba as well, they all expressed their opposition for the invocation of the Emergencies Act, which Trudeau invoked himself. So all these provincial leaders have opposed it, saying, this was about a week ago at the time, that, hey, we have enough law enforcement resources. We don't need to declare a national emergency over what is just groups of, minorly disruptive protesters, mostly cheerful and peaceful people who are just
It's a
having a good time and partying.
normal law enforcement matter.
Yeah. It's a normal law enforcement matter. So the provincial leaders have opposed it. But but people like Jagmeet Singh, leader of the NDP, he's hesitantly supported this measure, even though he's supposed to be standing for the working classes, whatever the New Democratic Party, the socialist leaning party. They've taken a very odd stance on this. And so there is this coalition, there is this population in Canada that listens and watches what the CBC says, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Global News, and the Canadian mainstream narrative on this, which has been that on the streets of Ottawa, there has been this extremist, radical, right-wing, racist, Nazi sympathizing group of people who are yelling out obscenities, yelling out racist things, have swastikas and Confederate flags, are harassing residents, are attacking police officers, attacking journalists and people in the media, people who are conspiring to commit some kind of violent crime, people who are armed and want to do harm. That is the perception that you get when you watch the CBC, when you watch the mainstream news. And so there's a large percentage of people in Canada who only listen to these mainstream media networks.
And so to be clear, Canadian Broadcasting Channel, that's a government-sponsored organization, correct?
Yes. Yeah. They've been paid by the Trudeau government. Several months ago, they got a bump in their annual funds for their organization, which obviously there's a major conflict of interest there, which for some people, for some reason that's just not acknowledged, that right,
how this crazy is state sponsored. This is truly state sponsored media. Yeah. The news. The news channels and these journalists are in essence surrogates of the government. I mean, I think that is a concept that's still somewhat foreign to us here in the States, because we all always imagine there being a free press and we have principles grounded in free speech. And it's hard for Americans, particularly when viewing other Anglo nations and cultures, to understand that other Western and Anglo nations don't necessarily have don't have those historical principles to think, okay, wait a second, our top news channels are actually funded by the government. These people, their salaries and their careers are are essentially under the thumb of the government, and that's got some implications that I don't think people in the States here quite understand.
Yeah, no, it's so bizarre. So many people in the US and the UK don't even know that this is true, and then when they find out, they're like, "Well, why? How is that legal? How is that not a major issue? Why is that not being shut down?" And I mean, it's not being, these corporations are taking in these financial incentives because they know, like the audience of the CBC and of Global News has plummeted over the past several years with the rise of podcasts and individual media platforms. So they need these financial incentives, otherwise they're going to be dead in a few years, right? Yeah. So they need the state sponsorship. They need the support of the federal government in order to keep their media up and alive, because so many people are not listening. People are listening to Joe Rogan or Ben Shapiro or Sagar and Jetty and Crystal Ball's show Breaking Points, or The Hill with Kim Iverson. People are listening to that. They're not listening to CBC or Global News.
So, and I guess that's my question, right? I mean, obviously there's going to be a lot of people up in Canada who are watching mainstream news sources that are very much concentrated around one narrative that, like as we said, is an extension of the government. Are even people who might have thought that the truckers were a nuisance and needed to pack up their tents and go home, are they concerned, or have they changed their tune in seeing the response here and the seemingly disproportionate exercise of the Emergencies Act and freezing bank accounts and financial deplatforming? I mean, has that kind of has that shifted the goalposts for anyone who might have been on the side, been against the truckers previously, who are now off put by this and say, okay, wait a second, this is immense government overreach. This is not terrorism. This is not insurrection. This should have been handled through traditional measures, in acknowledging due process, and are concerned about a suspension of civil liberties.
Yeah, it's. I would say that for a certain segment of people, no, unfortunately, they're still being fed these lies by the Trudeau government in collusion with the mainstream media that that it is important to crack down this hard, because if you truly believe that this is a group of violent extremists who want to overthrow the government, who are sympathetic with Nazis and racists and misogynists and homophobes, then yeah, I mean, sure, freeze their accounts, seize their vehicles, stop them, arrest them, because we want to, we don't want white supremacy, we don't want extremism, we don't want violence, we don't want these radical groups. So for a lot of people, that's kind of what they're being told, and they're not critical of the information that they're receiving, and to some extent, not to take away their own responsibility in this issue, but to some extent, right? If you're working a 9 to 5, and then you're checking Twitter every now and then, or you come home and you got to feed dinner to your kids, and you got to clean the house and do all these different things, and you play CBC, you're going to get a very limited understanding, and you don't have time to dig into the facts or read these alternative media sources and read these long essays on Substack, like the piece that I published with Glenn Greenwald. They don't have time for that. And so they're just listening to the media, and that's all they're getting. However, there is the Canadian Civil Liberties Association that have strongly opposed this. There are a number of, again, this is alternative sources still. So I'm not talking about mainstream sources, but a lot of alternative independent journalists here in Canada, like Jamil Javani, who's kicked off his radio show several weeks ago for reasons that have to do with his beliefs, and for him being a Black individual with the wrong mindset on a number of issues. But he's been strongly against these measures, and a number of provincial leaders have, members of parliament. The Conservative Party of Canada has strongly opposed this, which is good news, because the previous leadership in the Conservative Party with Aaron O'Toole was a complete disaster. It was this kind of progressive conservative idea of bringing people together and being inclusive, and not being as fierce or as strong in their opposition to liberal orthodoxy. And that was a totally failed project. So we now have a bit of a sea change going on with the Conservative Party, who are now strongly condemning what's happening right now.
And is it as divided as it is here in the States, right? Because we were completely balkanized here in the States. If you have conservative leanings, you will adopt the views of the Conservative Party and all the the issues now that become touch points for that, right? And if you are liberal leaning, you'll go in the opposite direction. I mean, and the U.S., and which is a lot of what this podcast is about how there's somewhat of or I don't want to say a silent, but a quiet middle. And we have 330 million people out here. That means there's going to be a lot of people who don't choose one side or the other. Canada, you have 37 million people. Is it that deeply divided between two sides? Is there a kind of great middle out there that, because, hey, the CBC, I mean, 37 million, I imagine they don't have an audience of 28 million people a night, right? Their audience must be a relatively small fraction of the total citizenry of Canada. So are there people out there who might not be by nature conservative leaning, or people who don't kind of inherently oppose Justin Trudeau, but who are seeing that this is being mischaracterized, that these protests actually were peaceful protests, that it's people singing and dancing and kids on a moon bounce and things of that nature? Or are they that easily duped?
Yeah, no, I think here in Canada, we have a multi-party system, right? It's not just Democrat versus Republicans, which I think is a totally antiquated, and toxic, and dysfunctional system that needs to be abolished in the United States. There can't just be two options. There should be multiple options, and that's what we have here. We have the Green Party, People's Party of Canada's Libertarian leading party, the Conservative Party, Liberal Party, and the NDP. So there's more diversity here. There's less of a bifurcation of views, and there's a broader spectrum of viewpoints here. And there is a silent kind of middle that, whether they're NDP or even if they're Liberal or they're Conservative Party or PPC, they are seeing this as an overreach. I can't speak to polls right now. There aren't as many recent polls looking at this in light of what's been happening over the past just 4 or 5 days, because it's so new. Hopefully more polls come out and we can look at some of the broader data on this. But anecdotally, I can tell you talk to people, around the block, people who are everything from hard conservative to progressive. There is this at the very least skepticism towards the government declaring this national emergency and labeling this group as some far right fringe minority. There is skepticism towards that. And I mean, I was just at the dentist office, yesterday, and I was talking to my dentist, and he's, as far as I can tell, somewhat of a left-leaning guy, although I don't know, but we just had this conversation, and he's like, what, this is totally insane. How is this in any way
that's
some
what
kind
I was
of violent extremist coalition? And I've talked to other people as well, and they also feel a similar way, because also I think people who are on the left should oppose these big draconian governmental,
because these were traditionally issues that were near and dear to the left: civil liberties, protecting the citizens from government imposition, financial deplatforming. I mean, this is crazy. And I guess that is my curiosity here is, does the average person look at the Justin Trudeau's government framing this as terrorist activity, invoking special powers? I mean, I want to read everybody the text from the Emergencies Act that was ostensibly used to justify invoking it here. It's got to be activity that seriously endangers the lives, health, or safety of Canadians and is of such proportions or nature as to exceed the capacity or authority of a province to deal with it. Does it seem like a peaceful protest that does use vehicles to clog a major thoroughfare, which is a crime and does need to be punished and addressed as a crime? Does that seem to rise to the level just described that was used to justify the Emergencies Act? Because, and it just seems strange that even as you mentioned, people in your community, your doctor, your dentist, who might be a little liberal leaning and is not a natural sympathizer with those protesting vaccine mandates, does this spook them? Do they look at this type of government overreach and see it as authoritarian in nature and something that we never contemplated and we do not allow in Western liberal democracies?
Yeah. I think for people who are honest liberals, this is a complete travesty. It's a government overreach that we could have never anticipated this a year ago, that this would be happening, right? I mean, you have on the other side of the border, you have BLM protests and riots leading to over $1 billion of property damages. You have various small communities in Minneapolis and Philadelphia that have been destroyed by the protests, by the way, which nobody talks about. You have car dealerships in Kenosha, Wisconsin, owned by Indian immigrants that were destroyed by Antifa rioters, right? You have, police precincts burning down in Portland and Minneapolis. And I mean, the list goes on and on. There was even, I remember in Minneapolis, there was I forget what it's called, but I believe it was a housing project for low-income individuals that was burned down by Antifa rioters, right? And there was no federal response coming anything close to what Trudeau's doing here. And there's none of that. There's no burning down buildings or attacking police officers or doing any kind of violence or looting or any kind of radical activity. Yes, there are certain people on the fringes who have questionable views. There was couple of people seen in photos with swastikas and Confederate flags.
In which we've got to view with a little suspicion. It's a little too convenient and odd that you've got the vast majority of these are checked out, and journalists have gone in there and gotten their hands dirty and interviewed these people, and they're singing Christmas carols and essentially creating a makeshift playground for kids, and there just happen to be a handful of Nazis on the scene as well. That I'm a little skeptical of that. But yeah, they're trying to use these they're trying to use the outlier instances, and then you try to compare that to the American government's reaction or non-reaction to actual rioting. And nobody can characterize what's going on with the truckers as rioting. It would be just too obvious if it were. And a suspension of civil liberties and first impression steps towards financial deplatforming is something that is of dubious validity. And it's good to know that a lot of people are starting to react to this. There was one really, really interesting piece by Ross Douthat who framed this as kind of a class war. His piece in the New York Times, "A New Class War Comes to Canada." And he put it through a very interesting dichotomy of those who exist and work in the digital sphere and can make their living off their laptops versus those who are blue collar workers or make their living in the real world amongst brick and mortar or with their hands, right? Because the pandemic treated those two classes of people very differently. The laptop class was able to retreat to their homes, get on their laptops, and continue to make money and keep their livelihood churning. Those who spend more time in the real world and don't make their money on the internet or with digital or electronic tools, it was much more difficult. And this was to a certain extent a bit of a rebellion from those who do exist primarily in the brick and mortar world. The way that he termed it was the virtuals versus the practicals. Interested to hear your thoughts on that. Is that really what's going on here? Is this a bit of a class war between the blue collar class and the white collar class that's now primarily digital?
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting dichotomy there, and I think there's a lot to be said on that. I think, yeah, I think especially like some people like truckers, nurses, people working on the front lines in restaurants. It's so bizarre how our perception towards those people have changed, right? This is another kind of corollary point here about how truckers were considered heroes a year ago and nurses were. And I remember my mom, she would always tell me like, "Hey Rav, go get the pot and the spoon and make the noises to show your support for frontline workers and all this." And then people on the left, people on the right, they were all united in support for people who are sacrificing or putting themselves at risk, but still doing this important work, whether it's delivering essential goods, people working in the trucking business, or nurses treating COVID patients, etc. And now we're firing people who are unvaccinated here in Canada, nurses, and also in the US as well, nurses and truckers. And for me, I guess I'm on the privilege side of things here. I mean, talk about privilege. I'm on the privilege side of things in that I'm unvaccinated, but I'm not. But I am working online. I'm writing articles and doing podcasts and making my money that way. And so I'm extremely fortunate that I'm not a
blue collar worker.
Yeah, or in my case, I'm not an undergraduate student at Stanford or Harvard or even smaller colleges in the U.S. Studying there, and the administration cracking down on me like, "Hey, get your shots or get the fuck out." I'm not there either, thankfully. Which was actually that was my dream in high school, was to get into Stanford, Harvard, or University of Chicago. I didn't get into any of them, and maybe that was for the good. I could imagine my heart being broken and my and my whole educational trajectory being destroyed if I had to choose between that and my own personal medical autonomy. So this dichotomy plays out in my life as well. And seeing people, family members working in the trucking, or sorry, not family members, but having friends and relatives working in the trucking business who have to make these decisions. Yeah, for them, the pandemic has, discriminated, right? The vaccinated
It's
versus
been
the
uniquely
vaccinated.
it's been uniquely disruptive to their existence, and it's kind of almost eerie, right? And another way that Douthit describes this dichotomy is even the way the weapons that have been used. Let's get to the tools that each side is using kind of reflect this real world and digital divide, in that the truckers, in order to make their salvo, in order to make their views heard, they use their trucks. They went and they parked their trucks on the bridge and on the thoroughfare. What was Trudeau's tool and weapon in response? To freeze their digital bank accounts and prevent them from raising money through crowdfunding websites. It's almost eerie. It really does seem like this war between those in the who primarily exist in the digital world and those who primarily exist in the physical world. And interestingly enough, I just see this now since you and I have begun this conversation. Quite a timely news break here is that Trudeau has lifted the emergency powers. He has revoked the Emergencies Act here, which is interesting because now we're thinking about, okay, well, what did he do all of this for? He took an unprecedented step in suspending civil liberties and attacking his own citizens under generally false pretenses here, only to revoke these powers a week later. I'm still, and I guess at least the question to me, and I'm wondering if you have the same question, is, then what was he doing in the first place? He couldn't have just ordered law enforcement to go and apprehend these people and detain them and put them through the traditional due process of the court system like any other criminals, and that he did this for seemingly no benefit, even acknowledging that it was generally unnecessary a week later. This all seems very strange.
Yeah. I'm just hearing this news for the first time. That's wow. Okay, well that's some good news for
Crazy,
once
right?
here in Canada. Time to open up a beer here and celebrate a little bit. Wow, and then have a real party if and when he hopefully lifts the vaccine mandates and I can get out of this freaking hellhole and actually do.
So you're still prevented. There's still a domestic and international restriction, air travel restriction on anyone who's not vaccinated.
Yes. Yeah. And there was various media opportunities that I've gotten over the past few months that I just haven't been able to do in the States. So hopefully Trudeau can do that, and then, give him credit where credit's due. But I think, doing this for a week, I think he initially did it because there was a strong group of people that wanted him to assertively and firmly crack down on these supposed violent extremist individuals. I mean, there was the one coalition that was like, okay, just drop the vaccine mandates and this will be done, right? But that's not really Trudeau's base. I mean, part of it is, and that I think a lot of these like ideological bubbles are shifting and they're converging on a lot of these issues, I think. But
no doubt
there was Trudeau's base that wanted him to crack down more on this. So he, his support has been sinking, and he's deeply unpopular, by the way, even in liberal sectors of the country. He's running a minority government right now. And a recent poll showed that his support has been cut in half. Only about 16% of Canadians would vote for him after what he's been doing as of late. And so I think he was showing this in a time of supposed crisis, he was showing that he still does have authority and he still can exercise it. That Canadians, all these people who are opposing him, are a fringe minority, and so he can show his power by abusing it and to supposedly appease his base. But I think that was a failed strategy, and given that he's now revoked it after a week, it was a total disaster and totally unnecessary, and it was not something that I think is going to help him in the long run.
Yeah, it really feels like he was a guy playing a game that he was not built for. He was not built, Trump, say what you want about him. He was built for hostilities. Justin Trudeau was not built for hostilities. He was there to look pretty in front of the camera and project a very surface shallow vision of Western liberal democracy in a very polite and non-controversial country in Canada. And he wasn't used to having to get his hands dirty, and he overplayed his hand well beyond what he needed to do in order to break the blockade. And he kind of irretrievably impaired civil liberties in Canada. He destroyed his own credibility. Sure, he might, he might solidify a little bit more of his base, but they weren't really going to leave him anyways. And yeah, I think he was flexing muscles he didn't have, which is, and we see how that usually turns out. Interesting, as Trudeau does release the Emergencies Act, but one aspect of this that is still, troubling but very critical to even retrospective analysis of the situation was the financial deplatforming, and what David Sachs refers to as surveillance capitalism, and using this as a precept to convince private organizations and financial institutions to stop doing business with certain private individuals. Deeply disturbing in my eyes. What are your thoughts on the financial deplatforming aspect of this? And, to the extent that a social credit system or social credit score might be an exaggerated way of putting this, but it does seem like your average private citizen is more and more at risk of being punished through the reduced access to private businesses and financial services for certain political views or activities that are really within the norm, even if illegal, are within the normal boundaries of illegal activity.
Yeah, I think the implications of this are quite dangerous and are quite ominous for what's to come in the future. I mean, you had one individual here that I wrote about in my piece who I haven't met her or interviewed her. I don't know her last name, but the local member of parliament tweeted about her. Her name is Brienne. She donated $50 to the protests and her account was frozen, her bank account. And like that is so egregious. Like that like you might hear that from like Russia or Ukraine or China, and it's like, like that would never happen here, but yet it just happened here. And I think it's I think the takeaway here is that governments can slide into oppression and tyranny so quickly once it can persuade and propagandize to the public that there is such a big national emergency, and the public who are hostage to the mainstream state-sponsored media then just take these lies in, and then the government just abuses their power, right? You convince the government that there's a big threat with, Iraq or with, 9/11, all these previous things, the war on terror. You put enough fear in the citizenry, and then you can persuade them to basically support anything, or at least get away with not persuade the whole population that what they're doing is right, but be able to do what they're doing without any major consequences for what they're doing.
The way it's always it's what a lot of the media would in the reverse direction comment on as a protection of traditional norms during the Trump era. That Trump continued to violate norms, and in and of itself violating those norms were dangerous, right? That there are no longer these boundaries and guardrails, and in certain cases as applied to Trump that was true. However, we also expect that there are guardrails in place that the government will not attack its own citizens, and will honor certain civil liberties, or there are checks on that. They're inherent. Forget legal. There are cultural and authoritative checks on how far they'll go in suspending or imposing on civil liberties, and we've gotten accustomed to those being protected and those guardrails being in place here in the Western world. But those might no longer be in place. Like there's now, and you're going to see that in a reaction from the financial community. There's a lot of banks and financial institutions that, in response to the Trudeau's freezing of the bank accounts and financial deplatforming, that said, okay, we're going to have to rethink our views on doing business in Canada, because we don't know when the government's going to come in and tell us that we can or cannot serve a customer, that we can or cannot engage in a certain activity. And because these banks, they don't exist to serve the government. They exist to serve customers. And the less government interference there is there, the better. And it's a really troubling precedent in that regard. And so, interesting, as Trudeau seems to, at least I'm sure he won't admit defeat, but seems to recognize that he did overstep his boundaries, and he needed to walk this back as soon as possible. And we'll have to see what this does culturally, and if it leads to any shifts in policies. I mean, am I correct in saying that all the provinces have released vaccine mandates, or there's still a couple holding on to them?
Um, no, I believe there are still a couple. Quebec just announced they'll get rid of them. So my province is one of those provinces that is not going to lift vaccine mandates
Good
anytime
old
soon.
British Columbia, right?
Yeah, BC. But hopefully by the summertime they might change course, because as we've seen in the U.S., the policy decisions are not driven by the science; they're driven by the polling numbers. They're driven by
Yep.
politics. So once enough people are tired of this shit and they see that the vaccines, there's a stable protection against death and ICUs, which is all that matters, and that vaccines aren't going to do anything for stopping or curbing transmission, then potentially Trudeau might switch and might change his policies, like we've seen with Boris Johnson in the UK, who's dropped vaccine passports. Like, incredible, amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're seeing it here in the U.S. Even today, and I'll take a little bit of a victory lap on this one, because I predict a lot of people took the other side of this bet about New York City, densest city in North America, hardest hit by COVID, and they had vaccine mandates. They seem to be of these cities that have of the cities that have vaccine mandates, they were enforcing it most stringently. And new mayor Eric Adams had come out in favor of maintaining, at least vocalized support of maintaining the mandates. And today he went ahead and announced that over the next month or so, they're going to be phasing them out. And it seems like every one of these dominoes that falls, knocks over another one, because much like a lot of these politicians want to react to the polling numbers in one direction. They also they don't want to be the last one holding the bag. They don't want to be the last person trying to enforce restrictions on their citizens when everybody else has dropped them, which, really speaks to really speaks to how unjustifiable the mandates were in the first place, because these are supposed to be permanent. If they really were that necessary for public safety, then these should not be temporary. But, the domino falling with New York City phasing these out over the next month or so, I can't imagine by at latest May 2020, there's going to be any regions in North America still with vaccine mandates. But we'll have to see how that prediction checks out. So just before we go, you've done some incredibly interesting work around your experiences with psychedelics, medicinal plant treatments, and some kind of adjacent treatments, MDMA, and how, and that definitely kind of funneled into your conversation recently with Jordan Peterson about contemporary North Americans who are searching for, it's kind of spiritual satisfaction, or trying to deal with some of the difficulties and trials and tribulations of modern life. Love to hear a little bit more about your writing and work that you're doing on that issue.
Yeah. I just felt it was my calling over the past few months to, as I'm building my own platform, to diversify a little bit and bring something new to the table, and not just to be political or ideological or cultural, but something that's totally different. And this kind of mirrors, what I'm kind of going through over the past several months, as I've struggled with mental health issues. And so it didn't start with a writing goal in mind. It started with like a personal healing goal in mind, of like, I'm consistently, lost in thought and kind of held hostage to whatever chaos is going in the external world, whether that's social, political, ideological, or within family. Like, so many things you just can't control, right? Like there are limits to how good a life can get, right? Like, you can do you can do so many things, right? You can have a loving wife and kids and make a lot of money and have a beautiful house. That still doesn't inoculate you from the worst stresses and tragedies and forms of suffering. So this has kind of been a spiritual journey for me of seeking. And so I've veered into mindfulness, meditation. I initially veered a bit into Christianity and kind of explored that and got a taste of it. But then I've found myself more in the Eastern realm, looking at meditation, looking at Buddhist philosophy. And then from there, I kind of went into psychedelics over the past few months, doing MDMA therapy, which I wrote about in a recent Substack essay, which I promoted on Jordan Peterson's podcast as well. And in that essay, I just write about my experience and how, among so many different things, I think one insight from that MDMA trip was that the mind is capable of being at peace right where it is and be free from, political pressures and stresses or desires to be better, to achieve more money, make more money or achieve higher career status, that there is a state of mind where you can be like at peace with what you are right now in this moment, right? And this is starkly different from our ordinary sober waking state where we are just, and most people don't even realize this. Once you start meditating or once you've done a couple of psychedelic trips, you realize how fucking neurotic and manic and insane and crazy you are inside your head. You're just always like checking Twitter constantly, or looking at Instagram, or reading comments, or somebody says something bad to you, or you get rejected by this person, and then
for me it's those moments when you start meditating and then you realize, wait a second, I've been clenching my jaw for 6 months straight.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so if somebody feels really stuck, or even if they are having a hard time meditating, that there is, I don't want to use the word shortcut, but there is there is a process you can undergo that is very powerful, that can help your meditation, and that's psychedelics. For me, I've done MDMA. A lot of people have these kind of experiences with psilocybin and DMT, and mescaline and LSD, where they're ingrained patterns of thinking and this kind of inertia of existence of you wake up and you check Twitter and Instagram, you have your coffee and you do this and that can be completely disrupted. And you can see that, whoa, there is this state of equanimity, peace, contentment, and inner freedom that is to be found. And most people don't find it, unfortunately, but through these experiences, you can learn to live a more free and fulfilling and peaceful life. And so that's kind of my mission with this new Substack. And I kind of hope to bring that into the fold in my writing, alongside my continuing reporting on the more, controversial issues like myocarditis and crime and policing and vaccine mandates and government authoritarianism and other issues.
Fantastic. Spiritual health, spiritual freedom, something we're all searching for. And a lot of people are becoming at least aware of new and innovative ways to pursue both of those. And your work is certainly accelerating that. I think it's fascinating. Love the work that you've done so far. I'd have to say, I'm going to go attribute this conversation to Trudeau releasing the Emergencies Act. I think we did it here. He felt the force of this conversation and had to go ahead and announce it. So, Rob and I are going to take credit for that. But either way, Rob, thank you so much for joining me today. Tell everybody where they can find you on the internet.
Yeah, I'm at Twitter, Ravarora1, RAVARORA1, and Substack. Anybody who wants to subscribe, feel free to do so, to get my weekly newsletters on unreported or underreported COVID truths and psychedelics, spirituality, mental health. I do that every week, a couple times a week or more, and that's Noble Truths with Ravarora. So if you search up ravarora.substack.com, you can find it there.
Fantastic. That's Rob Arora, one of the most interesting and talented young journalists and thinkers in the game. Rob, thank you once again.
Yeah, appreciate it.
I am Matt Bilinsky. Once again, you can listen and subscribe to The Prevailing Narrative on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening right now. Make sure to follow me on my socials at Matt Bilinsky, MattBilinsky. The Prevailing Narrative is a Cavalry audio production in association with iHeartRadio. Produced by Brandon Morgan, executive produced by Dana Brunetti and Keegan Rosenberger. For Cavalry Audio, I'm Matt Bilinsky.